Hi, I'm Carol Gold.
I'm Steve Clark.
And we're here today to talk about personal responsibility in light of, I would say, Ferguson, Baltimore, and what just happened here in Dallas. Steve, I think that all three of those cities, and more, but those three, because they're vivid in everyone's mind, really reflect two things: what mob mentality does and what personal responsibility does or does not do, depending on whether or not we take personal responsibility. I think Ferguson and Baltimore, much more than Dallas, reflect mob mentality. We know in hindsight there was a lot of ginning up of people in those two cities and professionals that came in to agitate on behalf of extremist groups, be they Muslim or Black Lives Matter or whatever it was. And versus Dallas, which began as a peaceful march and ended as a peaceful march. The march was successful.
Right.
They wanted to show unity. They wanted to show it could be done peacefully in the spirit of Martin Luther King, and they did that. The violence in Dallas was different because it was a lone individual who, although he may have had affiliation and instigation by organized extremist groups, he nonetheless took it upon himself and he inserted himself into the march, not being a part of it, and created the violence and the chaos. The point I want to make, and I'm interested in your take on this, is look at the aftermath of Baltimore and Ferguson versus the aftermath of Dallas. You had black and white in both cities. You had violence in all three cities. You had a tragedy or near tragedy in all three cities. But Dallas ends with the same calm that it started with. It ends with the same attempt to reconcile the black and white communities. It ends with a very enlightened police chief in Dallas who has handled this brilliantly, as opposed to the looting and the violence and the additional harm that was done in Ferguson and in Baltimore. So for me, Steve, and I don't know what it is for you, but for me, the difference is, number one, I've lived in the Northeast, as have you, and now I've lived in the South. There is a very different mentality here. There's a different black-white race relation here in the South. There's a higher level of civility here in the South.
There is.
And there's God still here in Texas anyway, at least. So what do you think?
So I'll give you what happened to me this week. A friend of mine who lives in the Northeast, we're working on a business transaction, and he calls me up and he says, I don't really like Texas, but I'm amazed how well it is run. He couldn't believe how well it is run from everything that he looked at. He's in finance, and he looked at the pension system. He looked at all those different aspects.
Really, the money too.
And he says it's really well run. And I think that's really where you start. The role of government here in Texas is that it's very efficient. The schools are efficient. The roads are efficient.
The healthcare is efficient.
Healthcare is efficient. You call a government office, they pick up the phone. The lines are not long. I mean, it's really well run on a government level.
True.
And I think at its core, that's really kind of the basis of it. The role that the government has here in Texas works, as opposed to, that's really what I can really only speak to is, for example, Baltimore, Maryland, which I've been to. It has a huge crime rate. The city has declined, for 70 years. It used to be a phenomenal city, right on the water, a port city. And if you go to Baltimore now, the people that live there will tell you there's many parts of the city that you can no longer go into. So I don't know. It's an interesting question. I don't know if is it a function of the government that's completely declined there? Is it a function of certain communities that have failed their citizens? But my takeaway is that the role of government is different in Maryland. The role of government here is different in Texas. In Texas, it seems to work and it's efficient. And clearly they were able to resolve these matters in a much quicker fashion.
A couple things come to mind as you talk. Number one, you said how government works here. Look at what just happened with Governor Abbott in the last couple of days. Our governor is paralyzed from the waist down due to an accident. A tree fell on him years ago when he was working, I think,
jogging.
A tree fell on him, paralyzed him from the waist down. So he lives in a wheelchair, confined, has some feeling in his legs, but he can't use his legs.
Right.
He was severely burned the day before the Dallas tragedy.
Right.
He came out and made a public statement No one knew. He was in agony. He had been second and third degree burned from the waist down. And he felt that even though he's paralyzed because he has nerve ending feeling in his legs, but he just showed up in public to calm the situation,
Right.
to let his constituents, his people know that everything is okay and he's a leader that we can rely on in times of crisis. Look how different that is from not only our president, but you see this in other cities. You don't see that kind of incredible leadership.
Right.
The other thing you talked about, services here working. One of the things I noticed in Texas, maybe it's my perspective only, I think people drive really respectfully here.
Much more.
Incredibly. They don't cut you out. They at a four-way stop, everybody takes their turn.
Right.
An ambulance is going by, everybody pulls over. You can laugh, but I think in a place where anybody could have a gun,
Right.
you don't cut people off.
Right.
You don't give someone the finger when you're driving. Up north, it's common. And you know what else I noticed here, Steve? People don't use their horns in their car.
Yeah.
I never hear a horn.
Right.
The one or two times I've used it, I have felt like I've been a public nuisance, and I only did it because out of habit of how I used to drive
Right.
up north. My point in all of this, I think the level of civility and the level of personal responsibility here is light years beyond where it is in some of these, forgive me, Democrat entrenched run northeast northern cities like Chicago, like Philadelphia, like Baltimore, like Washington, D.C., like Detroit, where people have been made to feel through government largesse that they don't need to be responsible for anything. Now, I know you have strong feelings about this government subsidy kind of mentality.
Right. So, I mean, one of the things that when before I moved to Texas, one of the things that a lot of people have commented on is that it is much harder here to get welfare, and it's much harder to get social services here in Texas. The standard or the measure to do it is you really have to qualify. There's a process that's in place, which is much more stringent, say, in the Northeast. And the commentaries that I've read because of that is that because that the populace will tend to do, the underclass, maybe is the poor people tend to do more for themselves than they do, for example, in the Northeast, where it's easier to get welfare benefits. The commentaries, the jokes that I saw was that nobody moves to Texas for the welfare benefits. So there's a higher standard. So in one sense, you could say, it's a meaner state. Well, in another sense, you could say, well, knowing that the people that move here know that they're going to have to rely on themselves a lot more. They're going to have to be more self-sufficient. They're going to have to do more for themselves. So it begets the whole question of rights and responsibilities. Who's responsible for the services? What rights do the citizens have, and what responsibilities do the citizens have to its government? Which I think is a discussion that we've talked about that is lacking in our society today. That there's a lot of people in say the underclass that just say, where is my benefits? Not realizing benefits also have burdens.
So let me plug your post, because
Right.
we just posted your writing.
Right.
I think the post is called A Message from Fields of Fire,
Right.
which is a book by, what's his
James
name?
Webb.
James Webb.
Right.
Webb?
James
Webb, a former military
Former
platoon
Marine officer.
in Vietnam.
Right.
So it's a post about, check it out. It's at abovethefraypodcast.com. It's about rights and responsibilities. You can't have one without the other. And the point of the post, if I don't kill it in
Right,
advance, is that too many people think you can have the benefit without the burden,
That's
so
correct.
to speak. You can have the right without the responsibility. And in reality, if you don't take the responsibility, ultimately you lose the right.
That's
because
correct.
you abdicate it to someone else who's feeding you, who's providing you with all this free stuff, and all that is a slow encroachment on personal freedom, right? And eventually the price you paid for the benefit is your individuality and your freedom, your liberty, so to speak, and your right to be autonomous. So we're in a very tricky place right now, because you and I have talked about this before. I know I don't, and you don't either. We don't believe there's a leader, a single person who's going to get us out of where we are.
That's
We're
correct.
way past that.
Yes.
That exit is long gone, right? It's really now about personal responsibility. It's about what can each of us do in our own lives to kind of take back the power. And we know it can be frustrating to feel like I'm just one little fish in a giant sea. But you have to remember, one voice does make a difference, 2 or 3 or 4 are cumulative, and eventually you hit a tipping point.
Right.
And that's where we need to go as a nation. So we're going to leave it at that for today. Pick it up again in the next video. Remember to check out the podcast at the post at abovethefraypodcast.com. I'm Carol Gold.
I'm Steve Clark. Thanks for watching.
Have a great day.